Number 3. Byron Carr. Charlottetown is the capital of Prince Edward Island, which is a province on Canada's east coast. Statistically, Prince Edward Island is the safest province in Canada, and murders rarely happen there. In recent history, there is only one unsolved confirmed homicide. It happened sometime after 3:10 on the morning of November 11th, 1988. Byron Carr was a 36-year-old gay man who worked as a school teacher. He was popular among the students and the staff. On the morning of November 12, 1980, the police were called to his home because he was dead in his bedroom. There were no signs of a break-in, and nothing had been ransacked. The police think that Carr invited his killer into his house after 3:10 a.m. on November 11th, and they had sex before he was killed. He had been strangled to death with a towel, and there was no attempt made to revive him. He was also stabbed once, hours after he was dead. Written on the wall in the bedroom in ballpoint pen was the message, "I will kill again." The police interviewed Carr's neighbors, and a couple of them said that on the night of November 11th, two men were acting suspiciously outside the house. This was after he was killed, but before his body was found. The police tried to identify the two men, but they didn't have any success. It wasn't long before the case went cold. Then in 2007, the police started to review the case. After they did, two witnesses came forward. One approached them in 2008, and another approached them in 2012. The witnesses did not know each other, but they shared very similar stories with the police. They said that a man they knew had confessed to them that he was an accessory after the fact in Carr's murder. They both said that the man went to Carr's house after the murder with the killer to find some evidence that the killer left behind. It's believed that they were looking for the killer's underwear. They didn't find the underwear, but the police did. When the killer returned to Carr's house with his friend, they stabbed his dead body, and they also wrote the message on the wall. The police said that they have enough evidence to arrest the man who confessed to the two witnesses, but he died in 2003. His identity has never been made public, but he was 27 at the time of the murder. He was a native of Charlottetown, and he identified as bisexual. He had just been paroled before the murder, and he had a history of violence. While the man confessed to his involvement in the crime, he didn't name the actual killer. The police still don't know who he is. They think that at the time of the murder, he was 15 to 25 years old. He was probably living a high-risk lifestyle, and he was also probably committing low-level crimes. The police were able to pull DNA off the underwear that was left at the crime scene. Unfortunately, they have not been able to link the DNA to anyone. One possible clue is the message on the wall that he would kill again. The police think that he at least attempted to commit another murder. 2 months after Carr was killed, a man in Charlottetown picked up a young man in a local park. Carr was known to cruise the same park. The man said that he took the young man he met at the park back to his house. Once there, the young man pulled out a knife. The potential victim then ran out of the house, and he was able to escape unharmed. For 20 years, the man didn't report the incident, and then he finally went to the police. He spoke with a police sketch artist, and it resulted in this sketch. The police are not sure if this was the same man who killed Carr, but they think it's quite possible. The family of Byron Carr says that at this point, they don't expect justice, but they do want closure. Number 2. Genevieve Zitricki. In the spring of 1990, 28-year-old Genevieve Zitricki was living alone in an apartment in Greenville, South Carolina. She was recently divorced and worked as a computer programmer. April 4th was another mundane Wednesday, and at the end of the day, Zitricki went to bed, expecting to wake up for work the next morning. Sometime during the night, a man forced her sliding back door open and entered the apartment. 2 days later, the police were called to her apartment by a maintenance man. Zitricki was dead in the bathtub. The killer probably found Zitricki asleep in bed. He beat her in the head with a small hammer that he brought with him. He then wrapped some pantyhose around her neck and dragged her into the bathtub. At some point, Zitricki was sexually assaulted. The killer then ransacked the apartment. Above her dresser, there was a mirror. On the mirror, in magic marker, the killer had written, "Don't with my family." At the time, the police thought that, based on the message, she was killed by someone who she had an argument with or someone who held a grudge against her. That proved to be a dead end because they couldn't find anyone who wanted to hurt Zitricki. The police found DNA evidence on Zitricki, and in 1995, it was entered into a national database, but it wasn't linked to anyone. Several years would go by, and there was no progress on the case. Then in 2006, the DNA was matched to DNA taken from another series of unsolved crimes that happened on March 3, 1998, nearly 8 years after Zitricki was killed. The series of crimes started over 550 miles away from Greenville, just outside Portageville, Missouri. On March 28, 1998, Tony Shearer and his son, Stephen, spent all day working in a farmer's field. On their way home, they stopped off at a friend's home. Stephen called his mother at 6:20 and spoke with her. Tony called home just after 6:30, and there was no answer. Tony and Stephen then drove home and found nothing unusual about the outside of the house. Inside, they found Tony's wife and Stephen's mother, 37-year-old Sherry, and the family's daughter, 12-year-old Megan, both dead. They were both tied up and gagged in the living room. They had been shot multiple times in the head with a .22 caliber handgun. Megan had been sexually assaulted, and this is where the DNA was pulled from. 2 hours after the mother and daughter were killed, about 40 miles away near Dyersburg, Tennessee, a man driving a full-size maroon van pulled up to a mobile home where a mother was home with her 3 children. It was a hot night and they had the door open, so anyone driving on the road could see the children playing in the trailer. The man said that he was lost and he was looking for a man named Jeremy Taylor. Suddenly, he pulled out a handgun. The mother fought for the gun and several shots went off. During the struggle, the mother was shot once. The man then fled in his van. The mother survived the shooting, and she was able to describe her attacker. She said he was 5'6" and slender. He had dark hair with gray in it, and he was probably over the age of 30. She also said that he had a northern accent. The ballistics on the bullets were matched to the bullets recovered from the murders of Sherry and Megan. This gave the police insight into how he may have gotten into Sherry and Megan's home. There were no signs of a forced entry at their house, so the police believe that he used a similar ploy of needing help and then pulled out a gun. Then in May 2017, the killer's DNA was connected to yet another crime. In 1997, 7 years after the murder of Zitricki, and a year before Sherry and Megan were killed, he attacked a 14-year-old girl in Memphis, Tennessee. He was able to talk his way into her home, and then he bound and sexually assaulted her. Luckily, he left her alive. The police and the FBI are not sure what the killer was doing during the 7 years between the murder of Zitricki and the sexual assault in Memphis. One explanation is that he was in prison. Another explanation is that he didn't take a hiatus. Instead, he continued to commit assaults and possibly other murders. One reason they believe this is because the murder of Zitricki was very different from the other attacks. He broke into her apartment, trashed it, wrote on the mirror, and Zitricki was an adult. In the 3 attacks that occurred in 1997 and in 1998, he talked his way into the homes and either targeted children or the children were believed to be the targets. Profilers think that during those 7 years, he attacked other women and children, and these attacks led to an evolution in his modus operandi. The police in Greenville and the FBI do not think that the attack on Zitricki was random, but they don't think that the writing on the mirror indicated that she had a personal problem with the killer. Profilers think that he wrote this to draw attention away from himself. Since the man was a serial killer that was developing his strategies, and he got away with this murder, he may have written messages at other crime scenes. The police think that as more DNA from other crime scenes is entered into the database, he'll be connected to more crimes. They hope that, eventually, they'll be able to identify the man who left the DNA. Number 1. Charles Morgan. On the morning of March 22, 1977, 43-year-old Charles Morgan left to go to work. He ran an escrow company in Tucson, Arizona. He didn't come home that night, but he wasn't reported missing. In fact, he didn't come home for 3 days. Around 2 o'clock on the morning of March 25th, his wife found him at the back door of their home. His wrists were bound with zip ties. He was missing a shoe and there was a plastic zip tie around one of his ankles. His wife got him inside and he indicated he couldn't talk. She got a pad of paper and a pen and he explained what happened. He wrote that he had been kidnapped. He also wrote that his throat had been sprayed with a hallucinogenic drug that could make him go crazy or kill him if he talked. Obviously, his wife wanted to go to the police and take him to the hospital, but he refused. Instead, he stayed home and rested until he could use his voice again. While he was resting, he told his wife that he secretly worked for the Treasury Department. He wrote that he was an agent and he was helping combat organized crime. At the time, because of the property laws in Arizona, the state had become a haven for organized crime syndicates to launder money. After the kidnapping, Morgan obviously became paranoid. He wore a bulletproof vest everywhere he went, and his belt buckle contained a hidden knife. He also started carrying a .357 Magnum revolver, and he kept several firearms in his car. He was also sure to drive his daughters to and from school. Then, almost 3 months later, on June 8th, Morgan went missing again. 9 days after he went missing, his wife received a strange phone call. It was a woman who didn't identify herself. She called his wife by her name and said that Charles was fine, and then said Ecclesiastes 12, 1-8. She then hung up the phone. Morgan's wife looked up the passage. The modern English version of the passage reads, "Remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the difficult days come and the years arrive when you say, 'I have no pleasure in them.' Before the sun, light, moon, and stars are darkened, and the clouds leave after the rain. In the day when those watching the house tremble, and the strong men are bent over. When the grinders cease because they are few, and those looking through the windows have dimmed eyes. And the doors on the street are shut, and the sound of grinding is low. And one rises up at the sound of a bird, and all the daughters of song are brought low. When they are afraid of heights, even the terrors along the road. The almond tree blossoms, and the grasshopper drags itself along, and desire fails. Because man goes to his eternal home, and mourners go about the streets. Remember your Creator before the cord of silver is snapped, or the bowl of gold is smashed, or the jar by the spring broken, or the wheel at the cistern crushed. The dust returns to the earth where it was, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. It is all vanity, says the preacher. All is vanity. 2 days after the call, and 11 days after Morgan went missing, his body was found near Sells, Arizona. He had been shot once in the head, and the sheriff's department ruled the death a suicide. Morgan's family, friends, members of the media, and some other investigators don't think his death was a suicide. It's important to point out that only the sheriff's department labeled the death a suicide. The medical examiner, on the other hand, didn't say if it was a suicide or a homicide, and instead labeled it an unsolved death. The first notable problem with the suicide theory is the way that Morgan was shot. Morgan was killed with his own gun, and it was found beside him. He was shot at the back of the head, near the top of the head. There was gunshot residue on his left hand, so the sheriff's department concluded that was the hand he used to shoot himself. The problem is that Morgan was right-handed. Why would he use his non-dominant hand to shoot himself in the back of the head? Another problem is that there were no fingerprints, not even Morgan's, found on the gun. For the 10 days he was missing, Morgan was hiding out in motel rooms. He died within 12 hours of being found. He was still wearing his bulletproof vest. Why would Morgan hide out for 11 days, drive out to the desert, and shoot himself in the back of the head with his non-dominant hand while wearing a bulletproof vest? There were also several oddities about the murder scene. The first is that, near the body, Morgan's tooth was found wrapped in a handkerchief. The second oddity and possible clue was found clipped to his underwear. It was an American $2 bill. On the back of the bill is an engraving of John Turnbull's painting, The Declaration of Independence. The television program, Unsolved Mysteries, said that the signers were numbered 1 to 7, however, it only appears that they are numbered 1 to 6. Also on the back of the $2 bill is a hand-drawn map of an area of Arizona. The map leads to Robles Junction and Sassabee, which are both towns in Arizona that were known routes for smuggling. Written on the front of the bill was 7 Spanish names. The initials of each name were A through G. Also written on the front of the bill was Ecclesiastes 12, and then arrows near the serial number indicating 1 through 8. Ecclesiastes 12, 1 through 8 is the same Bible passage the caller told Morgan's wife. What could a map of an area of Arizona, 6 founding fathers, 7 Spanish names, and a Bible verse written on a $2 bill possibly mean? Some investigators think that the bill was a code about who murdered him. It's possible that the message could have been meant for the Treasury Department or the FBI. They may have had a document or a file that corresponded with the written clues. If someone did decipher the code, that information has never been made public. 2 days after Morgan's body was found, the sheriff's department received an unusual phone call. It was a woman who only identified herself as Green Eyes. Green Eyes said that she visited Morgan in his motel room. He showed her a briefcase full of money. He said that it was $60,000 and he was trying to collect enough money to stop a contract hit on his life. The woman also admitted that she was the one who called Morgan's wife. She then hung up the phone. Unfortunately, Green Eyes has never been identified. When investigative reporter Don Devereaux looked into Morgan's financial dealings, he found out that he had done deals with at least 1, possibly 2, organized crime syndicates. One of Morgan's associates said that he kept a secret file on one of the syndicates. Morgan said it was his form of insurance. The secret file could be the reason that Morgan was kidnapped in March. He was kidnapped by the syndicate, and he was interrogated about the location of the file. After the kidnapping, Morgan found out that there was a contract on his life, and he collected enough money to try and buy off the hitman. He then drove out to the desert with the money to meet his killer. The hitman shot him and took the money. Backing up this theory is that shortly after the death, two men paid a visit to Morgan's widow. They flashed badges at her, and they said that they were with the FBI. They tore apart the house looking for something, but left without finding it. Don Devereaux made a Freedom of Information Act request for the FBI's file on Morgan. The FBI said that they had never heard of Morgan, and they didn't have any information on him. Despite a lot of circumstantial evidence, the Sheriff's Department still considers Charles Morgan's death a suicide. But the case may not end there. Morgan's bizarre death was featured on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries that aired on February 7, 1990. One of the people that they interviewed was Don Devereaux. 4 months after the episode aired, on March 14, 1990, there was a shooting in Phoenix, Arizona. A man named Doug Johnson, who worked at a computer graphic company, was found dead in his car outside of his work. Johnson had been shot in the back of the head, behind his left ear. The gun was probably fired a foot away from his head. The police originally thought that Johnson killed himself, but no gun was found at the site, and there was no gunshot residue on his hand. Johnson was right-handed, so if he did shoot himself, he probably would have shot himself behind the right ear, not the left. Devereaux thinks that Johnson was accidentally killed in a case of mistaken identity and that the bullet was meant for him. Johnson's office was across the road from his office. Johnson also drove a similar car to the one that Devereaux drove. No one has ever been arrested in connection with Johnson's death. Then in 1991, a year after Morgan's death, a freelance journalist working in Washington, D.C., named Daniel Casolaro, got in contact with Devereaux. Casolaro said that he had information on what Morgan was working on before he died. Before Devereaux and Casolaro could meet, something tragic happened. In August 1991, Casolaro traveled to Martinsburg, West Virginia, to meet a source for a story he was working on. The story was a vast government conspiracy called the Octopus. There were several aspects of the theory, but there were two main parts. The first aspect revolves around a computer program called the Prosecutor's Management Information System, or its acronym, PROMIS. PROMIS was designed to track criminal cases across the world. Supposedly, the Justice Department had the code modified so that they could spy on any other country that they sold the program to. The second aspect of the octopus theory is that in the lead up to the 1980 presidential election, Ronald Reagan's campaign team paid Iran $40 million to delay the release of hostages at the U.S. Embassy during the Iran hostage crisis. The delay would reflect poorly on Jimmy Carter, who was seeking re-election. But it would help Reagan, who had taken a strong stance against Iran. Sure enough, 20 minutes after Reagan made his inaugural address, on January 20th, 1981, the hostages from the embassy were released. Nothing in the octopus theory has ever been proved with any sort of tangible evidence. On August 10th, Casolaro was staying in a hotel in Martinsburg. One of the maids at the hotel found his body in the bathtub. His wrists had been slashed a dozen times with a razor blade. His death was also ruled a suicide. Casolaro's family doesn't believe he killed himself for several reasons. The first is that Casolaro was afraid of blood, so even if he had taken his own life, he would have picked a less gory way to do it. Secondly, his brother said that 3 months before he died, Casolaro received death threats. Casolaro also told him that if he were to die in an accident, not to believe it, because he had been murdered. Finally, Casolaro's notes on the octopus disappeared around the same time that he died. The notes, which he accumulated over a year, have never been found. Despite the odd circumstances surrounding the deaths of all three men, their deaths are not considered homicides, and their cases are considered closed. Thanks a lot for watching today's video. Hopefully you found it interesting. If you did, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe. We post a new video every Thursday and Sunday. If you already do subscribe, thank you so much for doing so. You can also like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. We may even follow you back. But that's all for today. Thanks again for watching.